Hello. So today we're going to be looking at the actual practice of focusing our mind, and go into that chapter. But before we start, let's set our motivation, consider our path and our commitment to our path, and consider the basis of our path being the suffering of all beings. Something that we don't feel comfortable about, and therefore have determined to, from a basis of loving kindness, cherishing, and a sense of responsibility, we've decided to do something about it. And therefore, in terms of doing something about it, we are hoping to improve ourselves, become enlightened, so we can continue to benefit all beings and bring them from a state of suffering into a state of lasting joy. So it's something to be happy about. So the idea here is we're going to do what we can to learn from this, and also to reflect upon and to consider how this might help us in our journey. So the topic is meditation, is primarily samatha or serenity, and or what we're looking to do is to train in that, or to develop our training in this. And I think it's a good idea again to sort of think about, many of us have years of experience of meditation, and or even just a short time of experience in meditation. It's very easy to sort of have a presumption of saying, oh, I know how to meditate. And it's like, okay, but what we're looking at here is to say that let's try to find fresh eyes, fresh ears, if you prefer, to reconsider and to reevaluate. Maybe from this we can learn something about how we may be not enabling ourselves as much as we would like to in terms of our progress with the development of a very, very powerful state of mind. So almost everything up until this point, including the two previous volumes, have been about working on generally on improving our sense of who we are and what we're trying to do in the world, our identity in terms of our commitment to a higher ideal, but also in terms of thinking about developing a conscience or a moral guide or moral compass to help us sort of feel a sense of responsibility to the world, and being aware of aspects such as consequences of our actions and so on. So in terms of our practice, however, if we really want to see something truly transformative, then everybody agrees, within Buddhism at least, that we need to begin to train our mind. And the way in which we train our mind is following Buddha himself, who spent years before he became enlightened training his mind with various masters, is through developing meditative serenity, or samatha, or shamatha, or shine, or so on. So we're looking here and saying, in many ways, this is our practice. Once we've achieved serenity, then we're able to meditate on emptiness, or on and so on, and we're able to achieve enlightenment. So the primary, if you like, the primary activity in terms of our practice, apart from our being good and considerate of others, and developing compassion, and so on, and being ethical, is in terms of actual practice, if you like, sitting down and doing something, is the development of serenity. So there are many things that people do in order to prepare for that. We've already talked about the various different types of preparation, mental preparation we need, the sorts of environment that we're trying to develop for that. And it's possible that we only get so far in our training, but whatever training we do helps us in terms of our abilities for ourselves and in terms of our control. So one of the aspects of this is developing control over our minds, and not in a way which is sort of denies it any freedom, but much more about the idea of being able to facilitate it to its full usefulness. And I'll talk about that in this session. So Je Rinpoche's chapter 3 is here titled, translated, Focusing Your Mind. And so what Rinpoche has now done is we've chosen the object of meditation, we've talked about the preparation for meditation, and so what he wants to talk about is the method of being able to focus our mind on that object of meditation that we've chosen, and he's going to talk about how to do it in a way which is most beneficial. Some of the common assumptions or presumptions that are made from various teachers, and many of which are still used today, and then also talking a little bit about how long a session should be, so we don't get too fixated on this or that or the other, and he sort of gives a good guidance about how to do that. So he starts off saying what to do, how to do it, what he calls the flawless method, or the best way of us to develop this serenity. And he says there are basically two primary qualities to the mind that we're developing, that we're training in, and it's these two features that we're expecting our training will actually lead us to once we're developing serenity. One of them is this vivid intensity or mental clarity. It's also known as limpidity, this sort of clearness, and likewise sort of unruffledness. So we've used the metaphor of sort of muddy water or clear water, and again what we're saying here is there's something about it being very, very still, very, very clear, sort of glass-like and not turbulent. There's no, a lack of turbulence or movement in it. Still dynamic, still alive, we're living beings, but in terms of its nature is one which is very, very, very peaceful, serene even. And then the other aspect of it, so there's this clarity, and then there's this non-disturbed nature. These are the two. So he says, in terms of the object of meditation, for instance, if we're imagining we're doing a visualized Buddha, which is one of the objects of meditation that we've just been talking about, Rinpoche says that there's the clarity is in terms of the fact that there's this vividly intense image, Buddha in our mind, mental image, is able just to rest there with no blur or no lack of vision at all, and then the ability just to rest, sustain that there. He said there are teachings, both traditional and recent, where they also add bliss, which makes three features, and then others that talk about limpidity, this sort of depth, this sort of clear depth as well, making four. And Rinpoche says, well, limpidity and vivid intensity really are saying the same thing. So it's not really necessary for us to repeat ourselves too often, even if we want to emphasize the point somewhat. However, he says, and also while delight and bliss happens in the first stages of serenity, when we first develop serenity, if we go into the later stages of serenity, the very, very high or sort of rarefied stages of serenity, which are known as the fourth level of meditative stabilization, then there's no bliss that happens in that state. It's sort of called beyond bliss and so on. And he says, so therefore delight is not always present as a part of the meditation state. And so for some sort of basic reason, he says, therefore we don't need to identify that as always being present. It's not always present. On the other hand, he says it's not too wrong to say that, because it's only once we've become a very, very high bodhisattva, typically 8th level bodhisattva or so on, that one uses these concentrations of such a high level. So he says really it's only going to be the desire realm meditations and the form realm meditations that we need to be concerned with, where there is an accompanying bliss, but the formless which arise when we're very approaching Buddhahood, then these ones we don't, there's no bliss arising from the stabilization itself. And bliss arises from other things in a different way, but not from the stabilization. So he says, primarily the two things to be aware of here is that there's the development of the intensity, this clarity, which is blocked while there's a laxity. So laxity is this idea of something being relaxed, too relaxed. He says, on the other hand, excitement is this sort of is the blocks sort of a one-point, single-pointed, non-discursive mind. In other words, turbulence. There's turbulence. While there's excitement, if we're too tight in our mind, too excited, then there's turbulence. So these two, he says, primarily are the two primary obstacles that we're going to be looking at. There's this relaxed state, over-relaxed, and over-tight. Or in the words used here are laxity and excitement. So he's going to say that we first of all need to work on the coarse forms of laxity and excitement, and then later on we need to work on the subtle forms of laxity and excitement. And then if we don't know how to identify them well, if we can't pinpoint exactly what they are, then it's going to be incredibly hard, if not impossible, for us to actually develop our concentration beyond a sort of nominal level. And he says, because it would be impossible for us to develop serenity until we understand laxity and excitement clearly and understand what these two obstacles are to our meditation, then, of course, without serenity there's no enlightenment, therefore there's no enlightenment available to us either. So he says, therefore, we must, in terms of our practice of serenity, developing our serenity, we must really, really have a very, very clear understanding, experiential understanding, not an intellectual one. We need to actually try it and find out for ourselves how to distinguish laxity and excitement. So he says, so I'm going to actually spend some time talking about these two things, these two conditions that are unfavourable or prevent us from achieving serenity. But I'm going to do it later on, so we're going to have to wait a little bit for that. And not only will I tell you how to diminish them, but also how to stop them, how to cut them completely. But he says, what I want to talk about now is how to develop in a manner which is conducive to achieving serenity, not just talking about how to knock the two obstacles, more to do with how to develop the ability to achieve. So it says, let's start again. Let's just go through a little bit more carefully again. What concentration, when we're talking about concentration or when we're talking about serenity, what are we talking about? We're referring to our attention remaining one-pointed on an object of meditation, albeit a visualized object or it being mental. We've already established that it's a mental object, not a physical object or a sense-based object. So it has to be something which is mentally generated or the mind itself in that sense. So in order for us to do this, our concentration, we need to have a single pointedness, remain fixated on a single object of concentration. And then not only that, is in order to do that, we need to have two things. Oh yes, because we must need to not only be fixated on it, but to keep it continuously going. So he says this, so we have it fixated there, it's fixed if you like, and we need to keep that continuously present without distraction. So these two, he says, the technique that we want in order to avoid distraction is going to be necessary, and then also an awareness of whether or not we're distracted is going to be important for us. So we need to know whether or not we are distracted, and then how to prevent ourselves from becoming distracted. So this is a technique which involves us not becoming distracted is called mindfulness. The technique for what is called identifying whether or not we are distracted is vigilance. And he quotes Vasubandhu, who's a 4th century commentator on this, who's, I think, Asanga's brother. So he says, mindfulness and vigilance bring about close mental focus, because the former, the mindfulness, prevents our attention from wandering, and the latter, the vigilance, clearly recognizes if our attention is wandering, always about to wander. I mean, it doesn't say that, but it's always about to wander. So it's keeping a sense, awareness of what's about to happen, but also keeping aware of what it is that we're doing right now, or keeping it focused, keeping that focused. So he says, if there's a lapse in mindfulness, leading to forgetting the object of meditation, what it is we're doing here, then we're distracted. And as soon as we do that, as soon as we're distracted, what that means is we've lost focus on the object that we're meditating upon. So therefore, the foundation of cultivating any meditation, but especially serenity, is the development of mindfulness. So this meaning of mindfulness here we're using is not quite, or doesn't necessarily appear initially to be the same as a sort of what's called mindfulness meditation, but in fact in many ways it really is. What we're doing is we're keeping aware of the object of our meditation. We're essentially, we're suffusing ourselves with the object of meditation. So I think in an example of an early meditation that's done in a sort of modern mindfulness program might be, for instance, to eat a raisin mindfully, and one sort of allows oneself to suffuse the flavours and so on of the raisin as one eats it. And this is essentially focusing and sustaining our focus on the experience of the raisin as we eat it. So in that sense it's similar, right? The difference is in essentially that the object of meditation there would be sense, is primarily all to do with the senses, whereas what we're doing is we're wearing primarily upon either the mind, watching the mind, or upon sustaining an object of visualization, a mental object. So he says, let's just talk a little bit about mindfulness. He says, how does mindfulness focus, keep on the object of meditation? So he says, once when we're working on now in mental objects rather than as a sort of a sense-based object, such as a raisin or whatever, he says, once we've sort of even got a coarse sense of presence, or a coarse sort of blob, or a coarse sort of idea about the object of meditation that they're doing. So he says, if we're visualizing Buddha and we're able to sort of have the golden color, or we've managed to get the body and the head and the legs and the arms, or just a blur, or just the presence of Buddha there, any of these according to our ability, right? When we start off, everything's very, very hard to sustain. We might have a flash, a very short flash, and then it all goes again, and flash, and it goes again. So as we're beginning to work on it, we begin to stabilize and recognize how to visualize. At first, it all seems very confusing. Now, there's not a reason to be to lose effort. What we're going to do is we're going to, or faith in ourselves. We can do this, right? So we need to work on saying, okay, once we can stabilize, just to keep a continuous sense of presence, or awareness of the presence, focusing our mind, then that's what we do first of all. So he says we start off with the apprehension of the object. It doesn't matter if it's faded or whatever, we try to stabilize it, but what we're working on is sustaining our attention first of all, right? So we keep our attention on it, just like we would on the raisin. What we're doing is just sustaining the attention, not worrying too much about clarity, just making it sure that we have this continuous attention working on us. This is the first step to do. And he says once we've added, we begin to actually sustain our attention, then we want to begin to stabilize it. So allow ourselves, notice that how our mind sort of shivers or tweaks or shifts slightly, and then just keep it back on focus. And as we do that, our mind begins to find it easier and easier to sustain that attention. So Sangha says, in Compendium of Knowledge, he says, what is mindfulness? In regard to a familiar object, your mind is not forgetful and operates without distraction. So Je Rinpoche here, Rinpoche is now going to break this down a little bit. He says there are three features we can see. It's the observed object is something that we are familiar with. This is very hard for us to sustain mindfulness on something that we're not familiar with, especially when we're using a mental visualization. We need to be very familiar with what it is that we've chosen to meditate on, like that. Secondly, the basic aspect of our mindfulness is not to forget. In terms of this forgetting means not to let go of or not to be distracted by the object. So here it says, what does non-forgetfulness means? It doesn't mean forgetting what I've chosen to use as my object, or forgetting what my teachers or whoever or the pictures have said about such and such, or it's not to do with this sort of things. What it here is doing about how we fix our mind on the object of meditation and keep it clearly without any distraction. So it means not forgetting what we're doing right now. Right now, our job is this. Not being distracted. So in order to do that, at first we need to work on sustaining this attention force. So this is one of the aspects of what we're working on, right? When we're doing our serenity meditation, we're working on a little bit of effort involved in sustaining our attention. And in fact, what we notice is that this comes and goes. So when, for instance, there's a background noise or a sudden discomfort or something pops into our mind, at that time then we need to, or is about to pop into our mind, at that point we need to increase the level of our fixation. We need to rise up to the challenge of saying, I'm going to sustain my attention at this point. And then when the attention is sustained, then there's a tendency for us not to have to work so hard. We bring it down a little bit. So it's not as if it's just like, sort of screwing up our face and keeping it like that, because we get very tired very easily this way. But what we need to do is to use mindfulness is this way of saying, okay, just keeping our mind focused on this one object. So this is that. So then it says that's without additional, having fixed the object, having managed to generate the object, then what we're doing is to keep it continuous. So, and then the function of mindfulness is to keep ourselves from our mind from wandering. So there's a point here where Rinpoche talks about an elephant. So this time that the elephant means is the mind is a coarse, untrained mind. So there's different ways in which elephants and monkeys and so on are used. And here there's a more general one. The one I used a few weeks ago is a bit different. But this one here is where the elephant is a wild elephant, and we need to train it or tame it to be useful, right? So the idea is initially we have a wild elephant mind, and what we want to do is for it to become a useful elephant mind. Now, the way in which this is talked about in the traditional texts here, including Je Rinpoche, because it's found in Bhava Viveka's texts and other texts too, is that how a trainer ties an wild elephant, to a tree, and then and then whenever the elephant does what it's not meant to do, then the trainer strikes it with a sharp iron hook. So the idea then is that the binding of the rope of binding is mindfulness, keeping it bound, and then the vigilance of striking it with an iron hook is vigilance, right? So I think we can do better than that now, and I not without changing anything at all. I think one of the aspects of this that's really important is to recognise that these sorts of training methods, both for elephants but also, for instance, for horses, are seen to be rather damaging in terms of their approach to the way in which the mind is involved in that. There's this binding, restriction and punishment method of training can leave its own scars. And while this is only a metaphor, I think it's also quite useful to extend the metaphor and consider how it would be if we were a horse whisperer, if you like, or an elephant whisperer to our mind. And one of the aspects of that is to say, well, how does a horse whisperer or how does an elephant whisperer work in order to be able to train an elephant without using violence or without using this strong, coercive or a strict or sort of painful approach to training where you beat the will down? And one of the aspects of that is to build a rapport, and the other one is to provide containment. So building a rapport is established from being able to be able to demonstrate care, and containment is all about sustaining attention, being aware of in the moment of what the animal needs or is responding to, so that we can respond and adjust accordingly. So in many ways, we could argue that there's sort of this care aspect to vigilance, where we're caring for, looking after the needs of, in terms of that. And also, if you like, the mindful aspect is one of attention, of sustaining our attention on the objects. So I know they're being contained. I think I switched out, changed it around a bit. But essentially, the idea there is to say that when we've developed rapport, and we're able to meet and to work with an animal, then we can begin to they can begin to develop a relationship which works. And within that, there's also sort of the idea of saying, rather than punishing our mind for deviating, we can use our moral compass, we can use our conscience as a way to sort of say, look, this is what I want to do, this is what I want to be doing. So the whole aspect of very much about why we're doing it in this first place is because we want to benefit all beings. So it's quite easy to say, well, look, you know, I'm being distracted, and being able to sort of just a little bit recollect, having started off a session normally, having developed the bodhicitta, the mind of kindness and of cherishing attention for all beings, with cherishing a responsibility, is then it can help us to sort of help us in terms of our direction, to sort of say, you know, I need to continue on this object of my meditation, because while I'm untrained, while my mind is untrained, I'm unable to help anything. So we can then work with our mind, rather than sort of attack it with hooks and bind it with ropes. We can sort of contain it and give it attention and nurture it and help it grow. So it's just a metaphor. But interestingly, or maybe not, but for me, I sort of find it quite interesting that also when we talk about driving a car, for instance, where we've developed a training and we need to make sure that we're able to drive a car, one of the two things we need, or the two things we need to develop and to sustain is due care and attention. We need to be aware of our care of both ourselves and also others continually, and as well as an attention of being aware of what's happening around us. So, and similarly, we're looking really at these ideas of mindfulness and vigilance are sort of really very similar in this sort of sense. So it's a good idea to not be caught meditating without your care and attention. So going back onto this, right, primarily what we're looking at is the idea of recognizing these two aspects. And yeah, so he said, you know, we can find Baba Viveka. This is a third century text. The erring elephant of our mind is bound by the rope of mindfulness to the pillar of the object of meditation, and is gradually controlled with the iron hook of vigilance. So these sorts of things, really, or iron hook of intelligence. And Kamala Sheila says, with the ropes of mindfulness and vigilance, tie the elephant to the mind of the mind to the tree trunk of the object of meditation, and so on. So, and Rinpoche says, you know, look, one of them says the vigilance is the iron hook, and the other one says it's a rope, and he says this is primarily, you know, we're both mindfulness and vigilance helps us to focus on our mind, so we don't need to be too worried about extending our metaphors. So he says, remember these two things, primarily both of them here help to keep our mind focused on the object. So therefore he says, although we're talking about vigilance, he says it's really this mindfulness, this sustaining, which is the main effort. He says this is really the rope. This is the best one for achieving concentration. But I think one of the aspects of this is a bit like saying, also, if we're talking about driving a car, there's a part of where we're, when we're sustaining attention of what's happening, our sort of situational awareness of what's happening right now, and making sure that we're doing what needs to be done right in the middle, in the moment. There's also this thing of looking ahead, slightly looking ahead without breaking our mindfulness of the moment, awareness of what's happening right now, is looking to see what's about to happen. So there's this aspect of vigilance, I think, which is to do with saying, being aware of what might happen, or what just has happened sometimes, or what is happening, to ensure that we put the right amount of energy into our mindfulness, such that, for instance, when we see we're coming up to a traffic light and everybody's slowing down, or there's been a car crash and everybody's sort of slowing down, we need to be aware of that's coming up, and then adjust accordingly, put more attention into, or more care into our driving, in order to be able to navigate what would otherwise be a difficult situation. Like that. Maybe. So Rinpoche says here that also mindfulness has a way of really suffusing itself with an understanding of the object. There's a degree of certitude, or a degree of recognition in the object of meditation. And he says if we do this too casually, without really sustaining a sense of certainty about the object, in other words, we haven't really determined what it looks like, we're not really familiar with it, then it's much harder for us to have the intensity that is required in order to sustain that in our meditation, and therefore we will be prevented from a very, very powerful mindfulness. So this comes back to Rinpoche's point made earlier on about this familiarity of the object. So developing a familiarity we can do outside of session. We can work on developing our familiarity, or we can do sort of a session where we begin to try to remember and recollect and develop and remember and develop and recollect, such that we have this strong familiarity, and then that helps us to develop this certainty about what the object of our meditation is. And he says if we don't have this, then it's very hard for us to deal with this sort of subtle relaxation that takes place, this subtle laxity. So he says, those who are working on a non-discursive attention, such as not using a visualized object of meditation, in other words, meditating primarily on like Zen, for instance, on sustaining a non-attention or just sustaining a calm mind. So like on the instruction, he says, for instance, stabilize your mind without thinking of any object at all, is an example. In this sense, we still must keep our mind from being, our attention from being distracted and wandering, because otherwise we wander into thinking about Amazon parcels or the shopping, or what to eat tonight. So he says this distraction is synonymous with the non-distraction. Not being distracted is synonymous with the mindfulness that doesn't forget the object of meditation. So while Rinpoche was arguing before that this is really, in a sense, a form of mind where the mind is the object. Here he's saying, if that's confusing, if we find that hard to accept, he says, just remember, in terms of mindfulness, our mindfulness is preventing distraction in this sense, non-distraction. And he says, since this type of meditation is primarily sustaining mindfulness, of just bringing the mind out, we also we still need to have a certain knowledge. The certain knowledge being the lack of distraction. Okay. So he says this doesn't matter. In the end, we still need to have these aspects of mindfulness and vigilance regarding whether or not we're practicing as of a non-conceptual or if we're using a mental object or we're using a visualized object. It doesn't make any difference. We're still going to need to use these two methods. He said, okay, well, now moving on for a little bit, he says, let's talk about some of the ways in which people have talked about this that have been less clear or have been prone to misinterpretation. So one sort of phrase that was used in 14th century Tibet was good relaxation is good meditation. And a commentary on this would be that if we set our mind at a high level, as explained, and then tightly stabilize it without discursiveness, without this sort of thinking, or if you like, then there won't be a fault of laxity. However, since this increases excitement, we won't be able to prolong stability, and therefore our consciousness is brought down. So he says that instead what we want to do is to relax this tightened mind, and then this brings then the mind quickly comes to stability. So he says one of the aspects of this is that this doesn't really necessarily distinguish some of the qualities of meditation from laxity and how we need to identify laxity. He says, therefore, we've got to actually have these two features, this firm stability of non-discursive attention, as well. These two features, not just a firm stability of non-discursive. We need to have this clarity, yeah, very, very bright clarity as well. So it's not just enough to be firmly stable, we also need to have this bright clarity. And he says another position which is wrong is the idea that laxity is when our mind darkens and becomes clouded. He says without this, then our mind has a limpid clarity, so it's very, very clear, and then our concentration is flawless. And Rinpoche says, he says it's important to recognize that this cloudiness, this darkness, is actually to do with lethargy, not laxity. So it's to do with mind sort of beginning to fall asleep rather than our mind being relaxed. And he says, I'm going to... So I may have made a mistake here, but he's going to talk about this further, so we can discover what he has to say about that in a bit. So he says it's true that if we have an intense cognition, a very, very intense cognition that's too tight, we might be able to sustain clarity, this clarity of insight, but the excitement will predominate because we're putting too much energy into it, right? We're putting too much energy into sustaining it. So then it will be very hard for us to develop stability because it's going to just wear us out. If we sustain our meditation after it's become very, very greatly relaxed, then we might have the stability, but the laxity will predominate, the being relaxed will predominate, so there'll be no vivid intensity, there'll be no vividness. This is extremely hard for us to find the right balance of tension in our mind. So not to be too taut, not to be too excited, so yeah, not too tight, and then also not too loose, not too relaxed. And he said it's for this reason, this specific reason, where we need to understand what it is we're tightening and what it is we're loosening in order to do this. And once we do, even then, we need to be able to continually learn how to moderate and how to achieve the right tension in terms of our mind. Now, our mind is, as I said earlier, the tension of our mind is not like we just can tune a guitar at the beginning of an evening and keep it tuned. It needs to be tuned continuously or regularly enough for us. We might be able to tune it for a while, and then we need to check in on the tuning, make sure it's still okay, and carry on doing that. And he says, it's not just me saying this, there's many, many people who say this, such as Chandra Gomin, who says, if I use exertion, excitement arises. If I abandon exertion, slackness arises. It's hard to find this balance. What should I do with my troubled mind? So he says there's several different Chandra Gomin, Buddha Shanti, and so on, all agreeing with this and sort of saying, yes, this is what it means, and so on. So he says it's very, very important for us not just to think when we have a clarity. Once we've developed a sort of stability, then it's not enough for us just to have this clarity of mind there. We also need to make sure there's this bright, there's a little bit of tightness there to keep it sharp, bright, and attentive, and revealing itself, right? So this tight focus is necessary. We can't just relax our minds completely. And in fact, Kamala Shila, who's written a very, very important definitive text on developing shamatha, he says, once we clear away our laxity, then we just hold firmly onto the object of meditation. He says this is our first thing to do. He says in the second stage, then he says, once we've quelled our laxity, by all means make it so that our mind very clearly sees just the object of meditation. So he says, and this is sort of typical just because there's been so many commentaries about this, that when Kamala Shila is saying clear, he doesn't mean we see our object as being clear. It means we see our object clearly. I think this is more to do with sort of language issues than anything else. So he says, and when we're developing our mindfulness, it's very important to sort of develop this, sustain this a balance, this not too relaxed, not too tight. So if we don't know it, then it's very, very hard for us, our meditation really not to be filled with thoughts and find ourselves making mistakes after mistakes. And a typical one, he says, is not at all unusual for many of us, even with many years' experience, is to spend 40 minutes a day meditating, and actually 35 minutes of those are completely distracted somewhere else. So we need to be able to sustain and be able to train ourselves in this. And this doesn't help us. It doesn't help us in terms of developing our serenity. We can say, oh, I do 40 minutes meditation a day, but if 35 or 20 of those minutes are spent distracted, not mindful, then we're not really doing 40 minutes meditation. We're doing 40 minutes of sitting, of which 20 minutes are sort of doing anything that they choose to be doing, our minds. So the point, remember, is to train our minds. We're trying to train our mind. Mental training is like gym training. We've said this before. So it's like if we're going to the gym, we're sort of sitting around the gym drinking energy drinks on the benches, talking to everybody. And you say, oh yeah, I go to the gym every week. Yeah. And it's like, well, what do you do? Yeah, well, I hang out at the gym. It's like, do you use any kit? Yeah, sometimes. So what are you doing? Well, mostly it's chatting, having an energy drink, always have a shower. And it's like, okay, well, yes, you're keeping clean. But the point is, say, if we don't use the kit, if we don't actually use that time to develop our mind, to train our mind, then it's not really what the purpose of meditation, the purpose of mind training is about in terms of serenity, right? So he says also then, while we've got our while we're managing to keep our continuous fixation on the object of meditation, then we also need to be checking in. This is the vigilance part, right? So what needing to do is to check to make sure that everything's going all right, checking in. So it's like, is it bright? Is it clear? Is it stable? And then, or am I distracted? Have I forgotten what I mean from doing? So we're like checking in like this. And he said, don't think for a second that what we're doing is we're stopping our meditation. It's like, okay, well, let's have a review. Well, so what do you think happened then? And going through it, and then going, okay, let's get back into session and find out. So the point is we're staying in, we're keeping our mindfulness. So when we're working in mindful, when we're keeping our concentration, and we've managed to get a bit of stabilization, so it might not be clear, but we've managed to sustain the object of meditation, then we can sort of use the power of that continuity, of the continuous, of our mindfulness. When it's reasonably strong, we can then use, sort of, if you like, just let our foot off the accelerator while we just check in everything, or just keep our situational awareness, and then just check in, make sure the speed's okay, make sure the heating's okay, make sure there's all sorts of things around us we need to check, and then we just carry on. But we don't lose our mindfulness of what we're doing. We don't stop driving in order to find out whether or not we're driving correctly, right? So that sort of thing is like, it's important to keep our attention while we do our care check. We don't want to lose our attention while we're doing our care check, right? Otherwise, we can cause trouble. So it's not as if we're losing our attention, we're sustaining that, but at the same time we just do a quick care check. That's vigilance. So we're checking for laxity, excitement. We're looking to see whether or not the energy levels are correct. We're looking to see whether the object's correct, whether it's vivid, whether it's clear, whether we're sustaining our attention on it, whether or not we need to add a little bit of energy or remove a little bit of energy, and so on. And he says, and we don't want to do this too often. We don't want to become panicked or sort of, check, because then that becomes a distraction. And we do it too not often enough, and then we'll find our meditations deviating again and again and again, and then it's just trying to put it back. So we need to be able to do it just before. That's why I was saying essentially what we're wanting to do is to look ahead a bit rather than just think about waiting until there's a disaster happened. We want to be able to try to catch ourselves before that. Not too much, not too little. So he says here, Rinpoche says exactly the same thing. If we are able to do this when the intensity and the force of our previous awareness is still strong, then it helps to keep, to maintain and sustain our attention. And then this allows for us to enable a long-lasting, intense stability. And then we begin to quickly recognize laxity and excitement. So it says this way, by how to sustain our mindfulness is through using vigilance. And Rinpoche then cites Asanga, Srabaka levels. What is a one-pointed mind? Any continuum of attention that remembers again and again, focuses on a consistently similar object, and is continuous, free of mistake, and possessed of a delight called concentration. So what is it to remember again and again? You perceive the object of meditation from what it is you've chosen, and you engage and you focus on that object with continuous mindfulness. And he says one way of thinking about this and being able to sustain this continuous mindfulness is a bit like if we're anxious about forgetting something. So I know, I've got to remember it's such and such's birthday. I haven't yet said happy birthday to them. Then it's like I haven't written it down. I've got to remember that. I've got to remember that. So a little bit maybe anxious, and we just keep it going in our mind until we're able to do it. And he says it's a bit like that. He says in terms of keeping to mind what I'm doing here. It's like I've got to remember I'm meditating on Buddha. This is what I'm doing. That's Buddha. I've got to remember. Yeah. Is it? Yeah. Okay. Oh, it's Buddha. Yeah. So like that. So one of the aspects of this is he says is really important to is to be doing this monitoring, which is checking in using our vigilance. He says if we don't do this, and this really is just keeping an eye on, if you like, the tuning pegs of our guitar, or if you like, sustaining our driving as we're looking out for obstacles, as I'm saying, using these different metaphors. It's like saying, when I'm playing the music, I'm concentrating on making sure the music is beautiful and according with what it is I'm playing. But while I'm doing that and concentrating on generating this music, I'm also looking out for, being aware of the fact that the instrument might be going out of tune. So I need to just be checking in on tuning at the same time. So it's this sort of continuous, not separate, a way of being able to use where I'm confident, whereas things are okay, is a really good opportunity just to have a quick check-in, tighten, loosen, adjust accordingly. He says, if we have this idea, so some people have this idea that doing anything other than concentrating on the focusing, sustaining our focus on the object, any form of vigilance whatsoever, is some form of discursiveness and therefore needs to be avoided. He says this is a mistake. So it's actually really, really important for us to be able to do this, because we need to sustain. We're trying to train. So if we're not aware of whether or not we're actually using the equipment correctly, checking in that we're using the equipment correctly, what we're doing is useful and valuable, then essentially we will tend to deviate. So lastly, a little bit more, just a tiny bit more on how long should a session be. And the question is often asked of people of saying, well, how long should I stabilize? How long should I be working on? Because it's very useful if I say, okay, well, I'm going to do it for so many minutes, and I'm going to work for 24 minutes. So it gives me a goal, gives me somewhere to set a goal post to meet at first. Anyway, right? We're working on saying, I find it really quite challenging to sustain attention. So, what's my limit? So Rinpoche says almost every single Tibetan lineage that we've had, so all the Himalayan lineages, they say start with brief sessions, and you should stop when it's going well. So this is good because it gives you develop an eagerness rather than sort of become disconsolate. So he says essentially, if we can do that, then it helps us, because if we're doing these long sessions, we can become quite weary. We can feel like, well, it's really hard work and not do it. And others have said that, he says, for instance, if we're doing long sessions, then it's very easy for us to fall into a pattern of laxity and excitement, and so we end up spending a lot of time distracted, and then we do less training. He said that classical texts don't really state much about length of period of times for doing this practice. He says Kamala Shila, who's a classical author, he says in the third stage of meditation, he says that we should be engaging in equipoise for 24 minutes or an hour and a half or 3 hours or as long as you can. So he says when Rinpoche says, when Kamala Shila is saying this, he's really talking about once we've developed serenity, how long would we use to spend in meditation on, for instance, insight and so on. However, he says in terms of training serenity, this is also sort of true. He said that if we are using this technique of combining mindfulness and vigilance to sustain our object of meditation accordingly as above, and if we're monitoring our meditation at correct intervals, it doesn't really matter if our session is a little bit long, as long as we don't get too tired. So we need to have enough energy to sustain us. He says, however, what normally happens when we're beginners and have a long session is that we can become distracted due to forgetfulness, in which case we might not even realise that we've forgotten what we're doing. We're thinking about, the argument I had with my brother or whatever it happens to be, and an entire session can be spent thinking about that rather than anything in terms of meditation. He says, and this is like not being able to sustain our mindfulness. He says, on the other hand, we might not lose our mindfulness, but instead what we find is we're not able to quickly recognize them when they occur, and so things tend to fade out and also eventually just switch off, and so it makes it very hard for us to practice. So he says, in particular, failing to recognize laxity and excitement after we've become distracted due to forgetting the subject or forgetting what we're here for is much worse than failing to recognize laxity and excitement while we haven't forgotten it. Because, of course, while we haven't forgotten it, we're able still to sustain our mindfulness on this object. So it says, therefore, it's really important for us to develop our mindfulness of sustaining the continuity of the object before anything else. And therefore, that aspect of working on not breaking mindfulness is very, very important indeed. He says, if we find ourselves suffering from great forgetfulness arising from distraction, so we completely forget our object again and again, or that our vigilance is so weak that we can't really do much once we are distracted, or we don't even recognize when we're overpowering ourselves or underpowering ourselves, then then we need to keep our sessions quite short. So we're working on, first of all, establishing and establishing and establishing and establishing. We're just trying to establish and continue a short time, then take a rest, have another go. And I think Geshe said, when we're talking about quite short, 5-10 minutes. So even 5 minutes, and better to set up the object, work on it, and then have a rest, then try again, work on it slowly until we can develop some skill. And then so like, you know, if we're doing a daily session and we're really beginners and we really want to try and get a strong, stable image, then it's a good idea maybe to have a 20-minute session but divided into 5 minutes or 6, you know, whatever, 6 minutes or whatever, three or four sessions. And then later on we can lengthen the sessions without having to change the amount of time we're doing. So like that. Ideally, then we can maybe, if we've got the time, we can do a longer session. So we can do like 40 minutes or an hour. Then we can able to use the same time and work on what we need according to our ability in the time. So it says if it's hard for us. If it's hard for us to forget the object, in other words, we've managed to sustain our mindfulness of the object, we're able to keep the mind, keep the object of meditation there, but we're still needing to work on how relaxed we are, or how tight we are in our mind. Then he says it's okay if the session's a little bit long. It's because we can we've got something to work with. So once we've got something to work with, then we can actually make it a bit longer. So he says, but in short, if we really want to do this, he says the best thing to do is follow Kamala Shila's advice when he says, as long as you can. So if the 5-word answer is meditate as long as you can, with it, you know, so it's useful, right? He says then the other thing, and finally the last thing to consider is if we have a temporary injury, so if there's pain or there's something really strongly distressing us in our mind, or there's something that we need to deal with, he says if that doesn't happen, right? So if there's no pain, sorry, I'm doing it the other way around. If there's no pain, there's no distress, there's nothing to worry about, then just keep your mind in your session. Keep your mind in equipoise. Work on developing the mind. He says, however, if this does arrive, so if there is this sort of pain arises, physical pain and mental pain, or a mental issue, or something you suddenly can't, it compels you to do something you need to do, he says, then stop, just immediately. Don't wait, don't have to close off. Stop, address the issue. Okay? Clear away the obstacles on your body, clear away the obstacles in your mind, then come back when you're ready and do your session. So he says again and again and again, he says, look, when we're talking about setting yourself a clock, if you're going to sit there grimacing because you've got a pain in your shoulder, or because you've hurt your knee and it's not working for you, there's no point doing that. You're just going to be sitting there meditating on the pain in your leg or whatever. So it's far better just to sort of say, okay, I need to work on that, and then come back and do what I can when I can. And obviously it's really good to try to establish a daily routine. A daily routine for this sort of practice is very, very useful indeed, probably essential. And then likewise also to study more on shamatha. There are lots of texts nowadays available on shamatha, but also Kamala Shila's text very useful. There's lots of commentaries by His Holiness Dalai Lama and so on. And this Lamrim text is beautiful. I found it very, very powerful. And Geshe Damshala has taught it many times. So there's many values. We haven't finished yet. We've just essentially started on focusing, how to focus our mind, how to develop due care and attention, sort of how to horse whisper our mind is really a nice way of looking at it. So we're working on training our mind without aggression, but in a way which helps to benefit ourselves and benefit all beings. And if we can do this, even a little bit, we are able to develop this over time, then what we'll find is we become far more able in our lives, and also far more able to benefit others as well. So what more could one ask for, really? Okay, so I think next week we're going to specifically deal with laxity and excitement. So there's these two aspects, and identify them clearly and how best to eliminate them. So until then, really, primarily it's working on mindfulness and vigilance as the two great powers to help us sustain our focus. And this has really been what this week's been mainly about. Okay, so let's dedicate any benefit from this, anything we can use to help us in our practice or in our path, to consider how we may be able to use it to inform our practice or make us better at developing our mind, training our mind, such that we can begin to really substantially make a difference for all sentient beings, for all beings. Okay, and then let's sit and meditate. If we haven't got a chosen object, and just whatever, mind maybe, or the breath, and if we do, let's meditate on our chosen object of meditation for a minute or two.